Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of History 102 with our co host Austin Paget. And this episode is going to be on the death of God.
Howdy. Welcome.
So, for a frame of reference, this video is kind of on the edge of what I'm intellectually capable of doing. What I mean by that is that I have different levels of expertise and different levels of skill, and certain topics require certain mental muscles that I haven't exercised that much. And I like challenges like this because it allows me to train in spots where I'm developing skill. And the reason I say that is that this video feels as if, when you're in the forest and you have to clear out some lands to build something, and so when you're going through, you have to cut out the brambles and the trees and the little green thorn plants, and then the huge vines that are everywhere and the singing nettle, where like back in Pennsylvania, if you have to clear out an acre of woodland, and I did do this as a kid, it's just you run into lots of just inchoate natural material. And what you have to do is just take out the natural material. And if it's a stone, you have to take the stone out. If it's a tree, you have to cut the tree down. If it's the brambles, you have to get your gloves and your clippers and cut the brambles out. And this is a very difficult topic to cover because it operates in a certain field of frame that we don't really have terms for or tools for, which I am developing, but I haven't fully realized yet. Where this, as a historic event, is more so a historic event about the history of consciousness than about actual political events. And I said before that I used to only see the history of the world in border changes, but that's clearly not true. Where if you compare how an ancient Babylonian perceives the world to someone today, it's huge. The Babylonian doesn't even have a concept of objectivity or just material things are what they are, because the idea that material things exist independent from the spiritual is an Aristotle idea. Even that wasn't Aristotle's full opinion. And the idea that of objectivity comes from a combination of Greeks followed by the idea of Christian truth. And so the death of God, or a 500-year period from the late Middle Ages until the present, is a shift in consciousness in which the average person around the world, and this is not just a Western thing, stopped believing that the universe was an innately spiritual place descending from God with meaning imprinted into life itself, in that every action was connected to every other through a web of consciousness. And we switched over to a purely materialist vision of the world in which only things that are scientifically replicable exist, and where the world is innately nihilistic, innately directionless, and atom to atom. And there's a lot. This is why I'm saying it's difficult to say the terms. And it's difficult because we haven't really developed the language for this topic yet. So I'm grasping around different terms that we kind of have and kind of don't have.
And the science resulting in materialism makes sense because for science to work, like you said, you have to take out the things that you can't see or can't measure. And then science becomes this very powerful predictive tool that generates so much that you think that it's all you need. But the purpose in eliminating the unseen in the scientific context is very specific.
This is part of the reason it gets very tricky, because the easy answer everyone thinks once they get into this topic is that science is the reason religion declined. That's not actually true. With the biggest book on this topic being A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. And when I started this show a year ago, Eric, our former co-host, wanted me to make an episode on a secular age a while ago, but I haven't gotten around to it. Where this is a book on the very topic we're discussing. And the thesis of the book is that he says, I want to study this topic irrespective of the influence of science, where science did have an enormous influence. But this goes through the other variables, which he names for being the biggest for the death of God. But it fits in this interlocking frame with lots of cultural assumptions that we don't think about. Where the reason I compare studying the death of God to clearing out forest brambles is that in trying to understand the death of God, or what separates us psychologically from our ancestors, because when I was growing up, I always wondered how come people in the past believed in magic or God or fairies or dragons and we don't. And the assumption is that it's just true. And if you try to figure out what happened, because we have almost no study of the history of human consciousness in our society, and there are very important reasons for that, but we have practically no study of the history of mental health, the history of how people perceived consciousness, and how they related to their environment. So as you try to figure this question out, you're cutting through lots of basically things in our emotional shadow, where the shadow is a Jungian concept of the things you're mentally trying to avoid. And our society builds a Jungian shadow of just the entire human condition, where you're not supposed to think about the human condition. You're not supposed to think how much we're like animals. You're not supposed to think why every human society is religious. You're not supposed to think why humans develop culture or any of those things. And so once you try to dig through it, you find there's lots of different unspoken assumptions that have been papered over in our society.
How does that relate to, because I understand what you're saying with animals, but then there's also a leftist trope where they also try to overly compare humans to animals in a way that relates to the state of nature or communism.
Thank you for that transition. You have saved me lots of effort with that transition. So,
Ooh.
this is one of the things Carl Jung and Charles Taylor talk about, and this is the best way to introduce the main intellectual and worldview difference between how pre-industrial people processed the world and people today do, where it's not a shift in pure worldview, it's that we categorically assess the world differently, where pre-industrial societies were largely idealist philosophically and were materialist philosophically. And so as an example of this, Charles Taylor talks about the buffered personality. And the buffered personality is a concept modernity has, that there is independent critical thought which exists distinctly from the context the person is thinking in. So if a person in China makes a rationally correct decision, they're operating on an independent rational plane of existence, which exists apart from their culture, apart from their sex, their class. The left also trips themselves
Mhm.
back up, and they say the opposite too. The left has no logical consistency, but I've said that 100 times. And so the buffered personality is that the human mind exists different from its environment. And that's part of the incredibly historically important Spinoza, Descartes, and Galileo axis, which split the medieval world from the modern world. And when you look at trans is the ultimate culmination, that you can have the soul of a boy in a woman's body, and this is a Gnostic concept. It only makes sense through the Gnostic paradigm the left is descended from. And then in the medieval world, in the pre-industrial world, their idea is that consciousness exists independently from materia, which we do have a significant amount of evidence for now. And so there's different types of consciousness. And the pre-industrial world perceived consciousness as their ultimate mental starting point. So when they're talking about God and the devil, they're talking about how we humans perceive our environment. So if you were on drugs and went to hell, in their worldview, you literally went to hell because it's your conscious experience. So they saw dreams and these things as parts of your living experience in ways that we don't, where we would see your material body and we would see that you materially did not go to hell. Thus, we would discount the things you saw on that spiritual trip. This one difference substantiates how religious and how scientific people perceive the world. And they originally were not seen as contradiction, which was a later thing added to it. But in the medieval world, they saw the collective psychology of a society as something to be defended, where they saw knights as defenders of the spirit, in that. sorry, they saw the church as defenders of the spirit of a society, where they were like warriors who fought off the Vikings or the Hungarians, or invaders fought off demonic possession. So the Catholic Church saw themselves as warriors against forces of demonic possession, and they saw mental illness. In their book, mental illness was demonic possession, where the seven deadly sins seized control of you and took you out of your own right mind. So in the pre-industrial world, religions were different frequencies of consciousness, where you connected your consciousness as much as possible with the founder of your religion, and you were working together as this consciousness block to protect your collective mental health against different sub-competing forces. And even in the Christian and Muslim tradition, you had the different planetary gods like Jupiter or Hermes or Saturn or Venus, which were these underlying archetypal forces that controlled human consciousness. So in the Trojan War, where they say Ares took the side of the Trojans, it means they fought more ferociously. If you were captured by Venus, it meant you were consumed with addictive lust or desire for substances. So they saw consciousness as controlled by these similar archetypal forces, and you made the decision of relating to certain subconscious archetypes for your own collective psyche, your own individual soul.
Right. And in terms of levels of consciousness, would you say that connecting it to the psyche in terms of um, anger, bloodlust, war, uh, sex, like those kind of uh, are those a lower level consciousness psychological traits that they associated with God? And how is that different than how Christians see it? Because it's not exactly associated with a mental state.
So Christians took a lot more from the pagans than they like to admit. And so the line between a lot of Christian mystic philosophy and pagan mystic philosophy, in a lot of cases, is practically non-existent. Where I say that there's the three hidden religions of Western civilization. And the three hidden religions of Western civilization are three different religions that stem back to the ancient Middle East that had enormous impact on the intellectual direction the West took. But it was through intellectuals who studied these ideas, and when they developed new intellectual ideas, they roped them back in. So these concepts you've seen ripple back thousands of years. And the three hidden religions are Platonism, Gnosticism, and Hermeticism. And this is going to take its own video, its own topic, but those three have had inordinate impact over Western history, where they're all, and with Platonism and the Hermetica, the Catholic Church chose to work with them, and they sanctioned the study of that. For Gnosticism, the Catholic Church brutally crushed them. And it's hard to articulate these because there's so much BS in the topic, and also those are all independent intellectual trajectories that you could spend at least an hour talking about them. And so, for example, in Dante's Inferno, that's a great understanding of Christian mysticism, because Dante goes up the layers of the spirit world towards heaven and towards hell. And in the medieval worldview, and this was part of the reason why Galileo became a huge deal, is that the medieval Catholic Church had sanctioned mysticism. So they had people operating inside the Catholic mystic tradition. And the mystic tradition inside Christianity gave lots of very intelligent, very compelling arguments that would make sense to a lot of Reddit atheists. So when Reddit atheists ask a stupid question, like how come God made the earth in 7 days? How come blank in Genesis doesn't make sense? The mystic traditions have arguments for all of that stuff. And so once you see the earlier tradition, you realize that you could have developed a scientific tradition with religion and mysticism, in that, as I say in the science video, almost all of the founders of early science were religious, and they were Christian. They were pulling from earlier traditions, where in the 17th century, a lot of the same, one of the biggest pioneers of early science, John Dee, he developed the Enochian language, or a language system he used to talk to angels. Or Isaac Newton based all of his principles of motion off the Hermetica and the Kabbalion. And it's just these influences are everywhere. And there was this smarter tradition. But then what happened is that for complex reasons, complex political reasons in the 17th century, is you saw a sharp severing between religion, science, and religion, science, and mysticism, which was part of the Kant. It's the Descartes Spinoza Kant axis. But you asked a smart question I don't think I fully answered. What question did you ask again?
I mentioned consciousness levels separated from materium or
Yeah.
material as being the view pre-industrial, and I was wondering how that relates to the concept of a universal through line.
Yes. So one of the interesting things is that we tend to view the collapse of religion as a leveling up intellectually, because we got rid of all these silly superstitions. But then once you see these things symbolically, you realize that these are fundamentally very important and brilliant principles that you need to survive. For example, the duality of yin and yang, or masculine and feminine. You see it in every major culture. You have to actually understand that men and women are different for life to make sense. Alternately, there's lots of religious principles like chaos and order, or each religion is the attempt to have a certain psychological system that you imbibe into your own consciousness as much as possible. And lots of religious teachings are ways of conveying very important wisdom. So once you remove the structure that religion gives you, because religion is designed to be a system for your consciousness to operate throughout life. It's like a rule book on how to live as a human. But in our society, we view humans as machines, so we got rid of that and we lost track of human nature. And with the removal of religion, you saw artificial stupidity, and you saw people make categorical mistakes that would otherwise not make sense. Where socialism, for example, communism was an enormous disaster because it threw away all this wisdom. But if they had studied practically any world religion, it would have said that human nature is not perfectible and that you have to work with that. Or that hierarchy is necessary to a certain degree, or that you have to respect the human soul of people and not just butcher people based off race and class, where religion contains a tremendous amount of implicit wisdom, where the secular worldview cannot see the human condition in as complex or deep terms. So they'll make these categorical and big picture mistakes that end up destroying them.
Well, it's almost as if they studied religion enough to know that it said humans are not perfectible, and then reverse, basically call that bluff against the religions which they associated with oppressive orders.
Yes. That's because both the Nazis and the leftists stem from Gnostic associations in early modern Central Europe, Central and Western Europe. And this is one of those things where very reputable historians back this up. The biggest author on the origin of the left, who is a professor at Princeton, Billington with Fire in the Minds of Men, openly says that the main origin of the left were Gnostic associations in Europe in this time period, because keep in mind that education was religious based in this time period. So the first thing an educated person would study was religious philosophy. So almost all educated people had pet theories on religion. And the Gnostic ideal, and Gnosticism is a religion from Iraq, and it would gobble on to previous religions. So you had Gnostic factions of the Christians, you had Gnostic factions of the Manichaeans, the Jews, etc. Is the Gnostics said that the true nature of the world is hidden inside your own soul. So once you accept that, you have to break free from the cruelty of this world, because the Christian concept is that God made this earth to be good, and then the devil they switch positions between God and the devil, where the earth we live in is evil, for place for the devil to torture us. Well, the snake that gave us the fruit of knowledge was the good guy trying to liberate us. So in the Gnostic worldview, the more you believe in yourself, in your own innate reality opposed to the world, the better you are. And then you need to team up and gain this hidden nous with the other people to break the shackles of this cruel and twisted world. And so that's the origin why leftists will say you need to understand leftism, because understand means take the nous or accept this spiritual teaching, and they can't understand that different people have different perspectives.
They can't understand that different people have different perspectives, and that's interesting to connect to the materialist view, which kind of erases universalism, even though the left is universal on another dimension. So talking about inconsistency again, but basically they say that um, different cultures and different people all have their own truths that work for them, which kind of contradicts the statement you said before.
Yes, everything the left says is completely contradictory because it's all about power. If you can give me any given leftist principle, I can show you them saying the exact opposite in a different context. Try me.
Right. Well, because they work you back and forth until they get you where
Yes.
they want you. Um, because they're both like hyper universalist and hyper anti-universalist.
Yes.
And then the right gets caught kind of reacting to one side of that or another instead of finding a synthesis
Yes.
that's more consistent with how we view things in the past.
Yes. And I mean, the issue the left runs into, which they get descended from Gnosticism, is that if the world is bad, then destroying the world is good. And you can't just take things like, you can't just shrug your shoulders and say that the world's going to follow its own direction. Because the left fundamentally does think life is bad. They think that the Darwinistic process between men and women, between the stronger conquering the weak, between the constant struggle of life, they think the active life force is bad. And they've effectively
Right.
used the bureaucracy to declare war on life and to say that everything needs to be its opposite. Because the purpose of the left is have normal structures, flip them on their opposite, but what you've done is you've forced every living creature to basically declare war on itself.
Yeah. And they love that Greek philosopher who was about kind of
Pythagoras.
maybe Pythagoras, but I think it maybe was an H or something, but he was about depriving himself of not just like experience, but emotion. So like dulling yourself to feeling, which I guess relates to Buddhism, because they want to escape life. It's like the what's the sci-fi, The Giver or something,
Yes.
where they basically give everybody drugs and they dull everything and they remove all uncertainty, and then people get flashes of what life used to be like, and they see beautiful animals and flowers, but also war and all this like emotion. And it's about like trying to tamp down the feeling of life through the removal of uncertainty is not a way to make a nicer life. It's a rejection of life itself.
Yes. Religions have a fairly honest assessment of the capability of humans, where, for example, world religions teach that basically people need religion and people have souls. Because what you look at when you study the philosophy of the left is that they do the same things religions do. They're just not honest about it. Where if you read the philosophers the left builds their worldview from, like Marx or Hegel, they basically literally say that their God is progress. They say that there's the natural order, and the natural order will result in greater equality as it had over history. And thus, due to this natural God or progress, we will win. Our God is stronger than yours. They do end up having ceremonies, they do end up having dogmas, and that stuff, they're just not honest about it. And so the left really has an issue with not being able. This is really impolite. They can't clean out their gutters because in a normal, healthy worldview, and this is one of the things religion does well, and the removal of religion failed at, is that a religion is a self-comprehensive worldview which gives you answers on how to psychologically deal with the different stimuli in your life. And once you remove that, someone's entire worldview and the entire society collapses because it runs into too many situations where it doesn't have a response to it. And the more things that happen in someone's life that they don't have a psychological response for, the worse they're going to be. And so with normal world religions, there's a framework to assess for things, but for the left, what they do is they make a certain real world thing sacred, like black people or women or equality. And then because all worldly things fail and have issues, when that thing fails, the left is at avoiding accountability, so they can't take responsibility for their failures. So what happens is that any given issue they have will balloon in scale as their entire worldview is incapable of dealing with it. So for the Soviet Union, as an example, they had sacralized that the Marxist economic system would work, and then that wasn't accurate. So what happened was that became such a huge thing where it blew out the Soviet Union as a civilization, where if the Marxists didn't promise material things being good, and they were like a normal religion that went for spiritual salvation, they could have shifted out their economic system without destroying their society.
Which is kind of what you see the Soviet people who enjoyed their time in the Soviet era more than the post-Soviet era say. They don't lean on the economic stuff, they lean on the non-economic stuff, however they felt in
Yeah.
society. Even though that wasn't really great either. And it's interesting that there's this attitude that nothing that we do matters because of the inevitable march of history, that progressive attitude. Yet they somehow are really good at taking action, political action. Normally, you would think that if you thought nothing matters, we're going to be right no matter what, history is going to march in this consistent progressive direction. Well, then we don't need to do anything. We don't need to vote. But they're really good
Yes.
at voting, organizing, being activists. And maybe that relates to so what's the motivation? Maybe it's the thing where if you enable someone to feel righteous while um, you know torturing people or causing harm or causing destruction, then it's the ultimate moral treat because then
Yes.
you can indulge in your worst senses and feel morally righteous about it. So there's
There's
something inspiring action. That's yeah.
Yes. I'm going to try to explain the death of God less so through people attaining rationality and gaining scientific objectivity, because that's just not how humans work, but rather a war between several different religions where leftism won as the religion versus Christianity. And Christianity and leftism are not the only two players in this game, where I've been reading Gustave Le Bon, is a 19th century French thinker who's brilliant. He and Chris Dawson, both of which I'm going to mention, were authors where I just saw them and ordered their entire back catalog. And I read 6 Gustave Le Bon books in a row. And he explains world history as series of fantasies and illusions that society is trying to reach. And a religion is whatever fantasy and illusion your society wants to rebuild the world in favor of. And he likes to talk about this as the death of Christianity and the rise of leftism as a religion, because he wrote this incredibly prescient book in 1880 that predicted almost the entire future of socialism. And socialism and leftism or liberalism, Chris Dawson, who's also an author who in a very similar field, he also talks about the gods of the revolution, or the gods of progress, where we switched from Christianity being our religion to God being our religion. And one of the things Charles Taylor talks about as his other factors besides this very painful to read 700-page book can be summarized into 2 major points, where he said the reason Christianity died was less so that he says he doesn't want to cover science for this book because that's been studied a lot, but he said it was inside the self-interest of elites to get rid of religion in order to mobilize and control their populations more easily, and secondarily that Christianity became disconnected from the society and became more about moral policing. And The 700-page book mostly simplifies to that, where it goes through those two factors across the historic context.
That is interesting because that's kind of the angle I was going to take it when you um, corrected my point in the beginning about how the scientific process led to the denial of the unreal or the unseen. Um, I'm forgetting exactly what I was gonna say about it. Repeat your last point about the.
So I'm going to take this in a different direction
Yeah,
because
go
I
for
want
it.
to actually get into the chronology where if you go back to the year 1500 or before the Protestant Reformation, people viewed their worlds as innately magical, innately spiritual, meaningful places. Then a series of events broke that. The first one being the Protestant Reformation. And Alec Reary, who is the biggest historian on Protestantism, and he wrote about this topic, he has an interesting book called Doubt. And and that might not be the title. You can look up Alec Reary's books, but it's an emotional history of the rise of atheism. And he says the first step of it was that the Protestants and the Catholics started fighting each other on theology. And the thing to keep in mind with medieval Europe is that it was Christian, but not in the way that we think, where um, there were lots of people who were Christian, but they were only culturally Christian, and they weren't that serious about religion. They were kind of doubting of God. They were kind of degenerate. Where in medieval Europe, the social organizing principle was Christianity, but that didn't mean everyone was a devout Christian or really cared or wasn't cynical. So we had this huge population, even when Christianity was the dominant state sanctioned culture, who were not fully Christian. And then those kinds of people saw the Protestants and Catholics constantly tear each other up. And then that made them think, oh, both of you are full of crap. And on top of that, the Protestants and Catholics, beforehand, there had been an understanding that lots of scripture was symbolic, where the fathers of the early church, like St. Augustine or Gregory of Tours, said, of course, Genesis is symbolic. When God makes the world in 7 days in the mind of God is different from the mind of a human. And stuff like Noah's Ark, or where you can't literally fit every animal on a boat. They said these are symbolic of broader spiritual truths. And this was the norm for the ancient Greeks, for India, China, most of the non-Abrahamic world. This is still true today. If you were to talk to a Hindu, hey, your myth of Vishnu isn't accurate, the Hindu would say that's not the point. And so people were able to understand religion on a more mystic, symbolic basis. And then Protestants jumping to sola scriptura to fight the corruption of the Catholic Church meant that both Protestants and Catholics, to figure out religious disputes, argued on a very autistic religious level, where they made religion heavily bureaucratic, losing its initial mystical spirit. And on top of it, the Protestant Reformation made both the Catholics and the Protestants significantly more socially policing, where the funny thing people forget is the Catholic Church was seen as a very socially fun place before the Protestant Reformation. I think they had like 100 feast days a year. People would take time off from work. People would throw parties. And as an example of this, and this is one of the things Charles Taylor talks about too, is the ratio of other sins versus sexual sins changed a lot from the medieval through the early modern world. Where in the medieval church, sexual sins were relatively low, where nobility would have concubines, the Catholic Church sponsored brothels. Medieval people had significantly more loose attitudes towards things like privacy or sex or violence or whatever than today. And so a big part of what killed traditional world religions was the obsession with sexual morality, while medieval ones put other things like pride or the church's magical power or other things like that we would never think of today.
And why did they start prioritizing sexual morality?
It was because the church became feminized, where the medieval church was so for the first few centuries, atheists were seen as a masculine thing because you were facing the world alone rationally. And so
Hmm.
religion was heavily female coded for centuries of European history. And a lot of the things that seem strange were true in the early modern world, where seeing a public hanging or a public torture was one of the most popular date options because young women were known for loving seeing people get tortured in public. It was seen as hot, and with the feminization of the church, sexual and family values grew of higher importance rather than a more masculinized church, where the medieval church was heavily misogynistic. There are stories of a young monk who was riding past a group of women where he had barely left the monastery, and his older monastic brother said, "Do not look at them, for they are demons." And then the young monk said, "They're the prettiest thing I've ever seen." And it's funny to see the medieval society where the monks would just openly. There was a debate in the early 16th century: do women have souls? And so you'll see this highly misogynistic, highly doubtful of women monastic orders, then the actual society was significantly more rambunctious and sexual and that stuff. And you'll hear stories of women like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Joan of Arc who had huge impacts on European history.
Right. We think of Christian society as being more perfectly Christian, but that kind of falls through the same falsehood of viewing humans as perfectible in themselves. Like obviously, there would be these ups and downs and variations in faith and over different time periods and within individuals. I was thinking about torture. Torture and executions is almost a sign of a lack of belief in God because you don't have confidence that they're going to be appropriately punished or account for their sins on the other side, or you don't think they did anything and want to get them when they're here. Um, but what I was saying earlier is they lost the cultural mores, and the church was the social organizing principle. So it organized people into certain behavior, and when they lost that trust in the organization, the individuals didn't have the knowledge to live out the Christian faith and high resolution or accurate manner, which then gets back to cutting the brambles. Because if you want a clear road to see this as simply as possible, it's basically just going back to uh, the inversion of Christianity from love and sovereignty to envy and equality, which was most common right at the very beginning of Christianity. So it makes sense that when you have these huge societal disruptions and then you have no organization and you've lost it on an individual understanding, that you would see the biggest breakdown since the origin of Christianity.
Yes. Envy, which is the origin of the left, is the shadow of love. In that love is the opposite of envy, where love is that you accept others for their failings, and envy is you look for others' failings to tear them down out of nihilism. And there were groups like the left, but they were messianic Christian cults, like the Anabaptists in Munster and Northwest Germany in the 16th century, who had a messianic cult that the end times were nigh. And so they gathered all these Anabaptists into this town, which, as the Catholic bishop who ran the area besieged them, they devolved into communism, they devolved into forced sexual communism, they devolved into multiple leaders claiming to have the will of God and murdering each other. They said civil war. So lots of things you'd see in Portland, Oregon were happening under the guise of religious fundamentalism. And that wasn't just Protestantism. It went back centuries further, and it was this consistent pattern. And it's useful to see the Catholic Church in the Catholic Church as just a universal worldview, where these people's concepts of reality were so magical and mystical that it was incapable to think scientifically without thinking religiously first. because the scientific existed inside the worldview provided by religion. So what Protestantism did was it firstly split apart the monopoly Catholicism had on the worldview of the average West European, which opened up competition, which helped Christianity in the short term by forcing these Christian sects to compete against each other, but then weakened the power of Christianity in the long term because you lost the solidarity of a single worldview.
And I think it will strengthen the Christianity in the long term because we basically did not have, we've never had a super Christian population. It's always been flawed Christians, and those principles were understood better at the higher up levels that helped organize them, like we said.
Yes.
And then I don't want to make it like too materialistic of a view, but the way that I conceptualize the progressive era is you have this enormous social disruption and you have simultaneous populist movements with the agrarian and urban population. And um, it it's that kind of disruption which creates the conditions that you found in early Christianity, where a bunch of people are adopting it, but there's not a strong understanding or incorporation of the values. And then the thing about science and determinism is less of a reason, more of a rationalization for
Yes.
that event.
That's one of the things that Charles Taylor talks about well, where with the Protestant Reformation, you saw a shift of a Christianity which was built for different sub-elements of the society to highly specific versions which brought out resentment. Where, for example, Puritanism was a highly rigid form of Christianity where you followed the Bible autistically in the least charitable interpretation possible, that God preordained certain men to heaven or hell outside their control, and we all had to struggle our mightiest to get the slightest chance of getting into heaven, where they banned celebrating Christmas because you should be wholly equally so on every day. They made you have 6-hour church services. So sects of Christianity like that made it a lot less socially popular, where in medieval Christianity, your child is born. It's done within the church structure. Your socialization and your education is done in the church structure. Your social network you meet through church. You meet your wife through church. The church throws parties and events, a lot of which were basically carnivals. For the creative people who'd be in the sciences today, they had mysticism so that they could explore the spiritual in difficult ways. There was a logical structure which connected Catholicism to the Greek logic system, so you could further Christianity through the logical structure. And so Christianity was this full social force where any given act was encapsulated inside the worldview. And then what happened with the Galileo, Spinoza, Descartes axis? Galileo's I alternate Kant in and out there, but the Galileo Spinoza Descartes axis is what separated the scientific from the religious, where, as we talk about in the video on the origins of science, early science was an extension of the magical worldview, where practically every inventor of early science got his ideas or dabbled in the mystic. And for example, Galileo got his idea that the earth revolved around the sun from the Hermetica. And Galileo was actually funded and protected by the Catholic Church until there was a squabble that was for political reasons later in his life. But the Catholic Church really fumbled it with Galileo, which made them appear bad because even though the Catholic Church was the biggest funder of science in Europe at the time, they picked the bad side of the Galileo equation, where over time it became obvious that Galileo was right, that the Earth did circle the sun. And Galileo, and that was important because by taking on the literalistic interpretation of the Bible, they were trying to say that physical space operated like spiritual space, where in mystic exercises you can move up the great chain of being towards heaven, and what that's symbolic for is purifying yourself spiritually. Right? The frequency through which your mind operates is a healthier frequency. But then, and that's how Dante perceived the world, where Dante, as I said before, is a great example of the medieval mystic worldview. But what the Catholic Church was trying to do was say that that's actually how physical reality worked. And then what happened was that it turned out no, physical reality is just it's space. And then there's stars, and then it's infinite amounts of space. And that was not a defensible position. So it got Christianity at one of its weakest intellectual points by furthering basically the pure materialist worldview, where for Galileo, Spinoza, Descartes, what Descartes did was he had cogita ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, where Descartes created this very strong distinction between body and mind, inventing the buffered personality, where he said our minds and our bodies are completely separated, and so we can't trust any of our physical realities. And he also said that the universe is purely mechanical and purely purely ordered, purely atom to atom construction, where Spinoza also established a worldview where God just is the universe. So God does not exist because God just is the universe. So with these three thinkers, on top of Kant, who developed lots of Kant's a complicated figure. I don't think I don't think it's worthwhile to get into Kant's context. It would take a while. But what these figures did was they established a logical structure where you could interact with the world with no connection to subjective variables. And so their concept of the world, this was part of an incredibly important intellectual breakthrough, which occurred in the late 17th century, or the severing of mysticism, religion, and science, which you should ask me about, is the only area of study that was worth value was replicable material scientific things, which severed most thinking from religion, which got ossified in its own little separate box that was incapable of adapting.
So how exactly did they separate those?
So the separation of science, mysticism, and religion happened in the late 17th century, where a unifying thread had been the scientists themselves, who were using mystic and religious principles to develop the principles of science. What then happened is that you saw a stark removal where religion and science made a deal to kill mysticism, establish different areas of study where they couldn't hurt each other. Because with the end of the 30 Years' War, you saw this mass horror at what religious wars had done in the previous century. So Europe entered this sort of tacit psychological deal that meaning and religion are innately subjective, and so let's not fight each other over who's correct on those. So everyone has their own subjective religion, which exists in their minds, independent from reality, in that religion is not a map of reality, but science is. So what that effectively did is it created this space to be secularized, which gradually shrank and shrank until religion had no place in the previous society. Where initially it was that, let's say, Lutheranism was the state religion of Germany, so you could enforce Lutheran expectations on the society, but for international science, you couldn't put those expectations. So science became purely material, science couldn't study meaning, religion became purely subjective and internal, where it's the Descartes differentiation between the external world and the internal world, which could not touch. The problem, though, is that mysticism exists at the cross space between all of them, where mysticism is private religious experience, and mysticism had created both religion and science. They both stemmed from mysticism initially, But with the killing of the study of private religious experiences, religion lost any connection to the genuine. Religion stopped being actually connecting with God. It became about following the dogmas, which killed religion's ability to actually touch people's hearts in a huge way. And for science, science became completely cut off from subjective human variables, creating science into this completely materialist, detached from human expectations field where you basically got rid of the study of human nature, which created this deeply schizophrenic worldview between a material reality which we could not touch or interact with as a person, or the soul, which become completely unmoored from physical reality, which is why we get trans. The end point of this level of these continuations of logic is trans.
Right. And once religion and science were cut off the tree of mysticism, then why did science eventually beat religion or
I will
materialist science?
I will run to the bathroom, then explain this.
Excellent.
So the way I'm going to explain this was the first step of this process was done by Hermetics, and the second part was done by Gnostics, where um, the first generation of science was done practically entirely by Hermetic thinkers. Galileo's idea that the Earth revolved around the sun stems from the Hermetica. The Renaissance, or the idea of improving the human character of society, that came from the Hermetica. The idea of challenging two theses against each other with the scientific method to get the third result, that's alchemy is a form of the Hermetica. That's the alchemical trinity, as well as the U.S.'s Trinitarian government. Because in alchemy, the Trinity is a sacred symbol where you have two opposing forces that jolt up to a third force. And I've spoken before about how so much of the currency and the state symbols that the US uses are overtly hermetic, because the Masons were foundational to America, and they were pulling from the Hermetica. And this stuff sounds like conspiracy theories, but if you study these thinkers, they were basing their ideas from something. And because this was a highly religious society, they were looking to earlier religious ideas. And there was this undercurrent of Hermetic thought to modern European philosophers, where you see it with Schelling, you see it with Nietzsche, you see it with Hegel, you see it with Bergson, where they were pulling from the Hermetica, or the philosophy of alchemy. And their idea was that scientific progress and religion were part of the same process of improving your consciousness, that you face struggle. Upon facing struggle and improving your weaknesses through suffering, you can burn away your weakness to go to higher levels. That was the original philosophy of science, and so that was the assumption. What then happened is that the first generation of Hermetic-based science was crushed in the 17th century due to the effects of the wars of religion, where the wars of religion created a distrust in mysticism. And so in the 18th century, you saw these initial religious ideas were fed into a non-religious concept, where the Enlightenment was based off pure rationality without these attachments to these sort of earlier concepts. What then happened in the Enlightenment is you took the principles of science and the principles through which these earlier societies understood these concepts, removed the context, and then without the context, people kept on making errors because they were unmoored. The Enlightenment was all about wiping the slate clean, operating out of pure reason. But the problem with pure reason was it was unmoored from context or an understanding of human nature. And so in order to not contradict these previous religious concepts, we created science independent from religion. But in doing so, it was completely unmoored from the actual internal reality of the human condition. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah, because science can give you 1,000 options, but not tell you which one to take. Gives
Yes.
you no guiding mechanism.
And so with the Descartes Spinoza, I think after the Descartes Spinoza um, Descartes, Spinoza, Galileo axis, you saw the split up of science from religion. What then happened is that science became stunningly successful, and it often goes unsaid. And the death of God and science, the way they evolved is as distinct things, although that's not how it had to be. And as science gained more power, so did atheism and the death of God, because people were consistently able to see that science worked. And science has radically changed the life of every person in our society. And it's been incredible. But at the same time, people associated science with nihilism. Because watch, this video is almost a sister to the video on the history of science, where science has power due to from what Michael Stravens calls the iron law of science, that you take a single principle, test it, and then through testing said principle, you can isolate what's going on based off which of the two hypotheses the test leans towards. And science, by its very power, is limited, which means it's a testing system. But you can't use the testing system for your entire worldview, because your worldview actually stems from your values, what you care about, your context. John Haidt has wonderful work about this. But what science did do is that allow different groups to rationalize their own self-interest very effectively, because they would study the things that replicate their worldview. Where we're in a worldview based off scientism now, not science, where the left just makes stuff up. And this is how we got to trans, it's how we got to race doesn't exist, it's how we got to genetics doesn't matter, progress is this immutable God that means the left is always right. None of these principles are scientific, but science, every single portion of the political compass has gone through a phase where they said that they were scientifically accurate, between the Sam Harris lib-left crowd, the modern left, Marxist dialecticism, Herbert Spencer's theories of Herbert Spencer's lib-right, his theories of capitalist and racial and Darwinistic competition, then the Nazis who said they were scientific. So what science did was it allowed what people took a testing method that allows you to assess data, and then they used it to say that the things that they subjectively believed were objectively true.
Right, and it's intentionally limited for a specific reason. It would be like if you used a telescope or something, and then, well, look how much farther I can see with this telescope, and then you just kept your eye closed forever and just only lived
Yes.
through the telescope. Is intentionally limiting for a purpose that is not all encompassing.
Yes.
And I think it's good to focus on the part about science as a way of getting closer to God, because I think this ties into, restoring that kind of methodology, but also ties into the materialism part. Because how does science get you closer to God? In one way, it's interpreting the scriptures, and testing it and things like that to try and get a better interpretation. But in the other way, it's what it enables through technology. It enables you to get away from uh, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and to like attain higher levels of consciousness through that method. So you can't make it all materialistic and scientific, but how I feel like there's not a lot of talk about how materialism, and you could even connect property rights and markets, not just science, relates to our spiritual development,
Yes.
and
I
consciousness.
am I am very glad you said that, because this is a point I was trying to make with a friend of mine who's a philosopher, where I said, if you have a purely materialist worldview, the death of God is the natural endpoint. You can't be both religious and materialist. And my friend made what I think is a valid intellectual point, that you merely say that God is within the materia, and that's the Spinoza take. But what I said is that knowing human nature for what it actually is, the actual functional difference in God is materia and God doesn't exist is nil, which is why everyone called Spinoza an atheist, even though he said God is the world. You need to have an ideal mental space between, in your concept of reality, where, as an example, to explain, because most people in history were idealists philosophically. They thought that reality was a dream by God. And there's some scientific evidence to back this up, although I don't trust my knowledge of physics, where we've proven that how you perceive particles changes your relationship to said particles. Or the double slit experiment, where whether or not you're perceiving a particle changes its motion. Or it's impossible to, in a purely materialist worldview, you could predict atom to atom movement because block hits this block, block hits this block, block hits this block. What the
Mhm.
reality that we found scientifically is it's almost as if particles are choosing in each second where to move. And the pure materialist paradigm was destroyed in physics a century ago, where we don't have the Descartes worldview. But physics keeps on being unable to act. And physics research has stalled since the 70s. That's one of the things that my friend Mark Andreessen recently spoke about. And I think part of the reason physics research has stalled is that if you were to study the pre-industrial views that reality is a series of strings by consciousness, you might get different results, but you're not allowed to jump out of the materialist frame. And I don't know crap about physics. I'm just saying shit. You guys should fact check me. But as a historian, I would try to figure out the worldview that people had for all of history, and then try to see if that fits with the current physics knowledge. But with with the ideal worldview, it's what I spoke of before with the Greeks or the medievals who saw reality as these different archetypal spirits, much like the Jungian tradition, which play across reality. So there's the archetypal principle of evil, the archetypal principle of good, the archetypes of the feminine, the masculine, just for the simple ones. And you as a soul and as a person, you have to choose which archetypes you relate to, where in this worldview, reality has its own map, which is comparable to the map of the material world. And my personal theory is that the relationship between materia and ideal is masculine feminine, that they have to couple up based off their core strengths and weaknesses, where all materia beyond a certain level of consciousness need to have the ideal, and the ideal and the material are both looking for their best match, much like man and woman. That's my theory. And in that worldview, the gods exist because if you study human history, you relate to certain subconscious archetypes. And so you can see humans who have to relate to consciousness relating to said consciousnesses like religions, which, because they manifest, religions and philosophies show that ideas can rework the world in their image because our entire reality was built by humans with ideas. And when we were cellular life forms, the only other life and the only other drama to life were other cellular life forms. But as the power of our minds and consciousness grew, life's story increased in complexity from cellular life forms till we have transcontinental civilizations.
Right. And that's why autistic people, men, cannot speak to women because
Yes.
it's rational and women have an inherent like mystic quality. Um, and then you relate this to the materialist view. That's why you hear a lot of Christians say that the more science discovers, the more it confirms my religious view as opposed to a purely material view. Because, like you said, with chaos theory and particles being observed, uh, there's ways you can rationalize a materialistic reality within this discovered context, but there's no way you can prove a material reality. And the deeper
Yes.
you go, the harder it is to prove. And that's become a consistent principle. So it's you could logically infer that looking deeper and deeper is not going to suddenly reverse that dynamic. And you can say God is within the material. That's what they say. And that's because, and this relates to God complexes, because God complexes are misunderstood. They're not the result of overestimating your ability to shape the lives of others or shape the world. They're a result of underestimating God, who does not shape life but creates life. So,
Yes.
like you said, it's still no different than saying God doesn't exist
Good
because you're
point.
misunderstanding what God is.
Good point. Um, the religious person, or at least the well-developed religious person, perceives reality neurologically different from a modern atheist. And this is one of the things that The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist talks about. Um, which is a book on the subdivided neurologies of the brain. And McGilchrist just made like a 1,500 page book that I bought on the nature of matter and consciousness in neurology. And I'm excited to read it, but man, that's going to be like another Maps of Meaning. That's going to be brutal to read. But so with the neurology, right hemisphere can I love the example that the right hemisphere can draw an entire like cow, an entire person. The left hemisphere can only draw half of it. I think it's beautifully symbolic. And the right
Mhm.
hemisphere, when tested, is consistently accurate while the left isn't. The left can only see the world through mechanical flow charts, through things you can touch, through power and money, and it's incapable of seeing intangible factors like change over time, nuance, the big picture, emotion, meaning, where the right hemisphere sees that as part of its consciousness. What we did with science was we made only left hemisphere thought tolerated in society, and we progressively got rid of the space for right hemisphere thought so that our entire world was based off money, power, control, material things, with the complete destruction of the right hemisphere things across the culture, which makes sense because the left hemisphere thinks that it is the only thing that exists and it always has complete certainty in its answer. What happened, though, was that we correlated the growing wealth of our modern civilization with the use of the left hemisphere. So we created this aesthetic of sterility and reason, and we believed in the aesthetic. The reality was that we had several testing methods like science or democracy or capitalism said testing methods were highly useful, but it was the method itself, it wasn't the aesthetic. Because we got stuck on the left hemisphere being the reason why we succeeded rather than these various because we got rid of the actual methods like capitalism or science, which led us to have that success. So we forgot that that was the things that made us successful, rather
Mhm.
than the aesthetic of the left hemisphere.
Right, which is what happens when you cut fruit off a tree. Um, and it's almost like the left hemisphere is mid because it can only see half the picture. The right hemisphere is like the low IQ,
Yeah, it's the
and then the
medium.
integration is the high IQ. So the high
Yes.
IQ is like a nicely drawn cow. The low IQ is a crappily drawn cow, and the mid is just half a cow
Yes.
crying because he's confused.
That,
Uh,
you're exactly right. Because and I was watching Mentis Wave today. He had made a few pretty good videos about this, about midwits, where the left hemisphere is the system based using school, and we've made our worldview as left hemisphere as possible through schools, through how corporations work, through the science structure, and we support the left hemisphere, not science or the truth, because if we believed in science or truth, we'd have to talk about sex or race or human consciousness or these uncomfortable things. But everything has to fit within our left hemisphere coded options of equality, socialization, progress. So we use the left hemisphere from those pre-established faith conditions. Then we ignore
mhm.
things that don't fit inside the model. Like Black Americans as individuals and as a people are really different from the left's understanding. So what the left does is it created this false mirrored left hemisphere image of the world, and they don't interact with the real world in all its complexity. They interact with the theory they developed. They're not touching physical reality, and because they're touching their ideology's projection of the world, which stems from the left hemisphere, which in their own worldview is right by definition. Thus, there can't be God, because their entire worldview is atoms of their left hemisphere projection of an atom to atom world.
Right. It's a Tower of Babel of rationality, like you said,
Exactly.
because when it starts creating inconsistencies, then you have to rationalize around the denial of human nature. And there's the only option they have is gas.
Yes.
Um,
In
yeah.
In Python, you have as if clauses, And so, with the way you'd code Python, as you make the as if clause and another as if clause, and they build their worldview as if it's as if clauses. This isn't just the left, it's liberals, it's Nazis, it's technologists, it's all the modernist projects. And we
Mhm.
see the modernist projects as vastly more advanced than previous world religions, but in reality, the world religions have vastly more complex and subtle worldviews than the modernists do. So we're taking a step down. We're taking a large step downwards in development from the what our educated ancestors had 500 years ago, and at least in wisdom, although we've have more like facts about the world and we have a better understanding of mechanically how the world works in a big level, we lack the wisdom. And with it's in spiral dynamics, there's level six, and so level four is traditional world religions, which are God tells us the truth. Level five is reason, and that peaked in like World War One. Level six is equality, of where you get smart and wealthy enough, you can cycle back to really stupid beliefs. Level seven, which is the ability that you and I are at, is the ability to integrate each of these and put together what their core strengths are at different stages. And one of the great goals I want to reach is to help them move the right from level 5 to 7. Because if we can get the right to 7, we will win and change the world in a very positive way.
And how is level five vulnerable to level six, even though it's closer to level seven in its prescription?
So, once you get stuck in level six's mental traps, it's very hard to get out because you get stuck in the argument of as if clauses, of as if we believe in equality, as if equality is true, as if we need the government to attain equality. Because what the 19th century European what a lot of the 18th and 19th century European thinkers were doing is playing with definitions enough till you could get an argument that you could rationalize. Then once you've rationalized the argument effectively, you can change the world for it. Marx, and they play lots of complex definition games that Marx was rationalizing. If if equality is the natural condition of history, then we should have the revolution. But I dispute that there is a natural end to history. I dispute that equality is that. I dispute that this will naturally happen. So you have to. The way they stack it up is that the more as if clauses you add, the better. The reality is have as few as if clauses and just relate to reality as it physically is. Because when you look at me and the thinking I do, I always say, this is a specific thing. Let me relate to it. Let me try to see what it is and what it cares about, and not add in all these ridiculous as if clauses to make me look smart.
And if we broke down some specific examples of how this different kind of thinking relates to a concept, is maybe like level five, you have rationality, where you're like, um, think maybe totally in terms of um universal principles.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
I'm
okay,
sorry to
good.
cut you off, but I can see the argument you're trying to make, and I think I can short circuit it. So
Perfect.
six overtook five with the myth of progress, where the god of progress, if the Hermetics failed at their concept of science, then progress came in, and progress was the idea that things just naturally get better. And
Hmm.
because the fives, or the rationalists, because they were enchanted by the myth of progress, they gave up rational consistency for progress, and the left created a very nice idea that they were the next step of progress in the linear line upwards. That turned out to be wrong, and it's why like the bourgeois and the capitalists have given up to the left so weakly, while the Christians and the pre-modernists fight on against the left.
Uh, uh, why is it that the
So
capitalists gave
I
up?
articulated that poorly. I understood that as a so The rhinos and the boomer cons. The boomer cons
Hmm.
gave up to the left because I used the terms improperly. The boomer cons
Got
gave
it.
up to the left because the boomer cons believe in progress and they see the left as people who are trying
Mm-hmm.
to attain progress too quickly. What happened with the younger conservatives is that the younger conservatives just don't believe in progress. And so
Yeah.
these are two very different things because to us, giving concessions to the left is losing. For the boomer cons, it's going a little too fast.
Yes. And then so then if progressives driving the speed limit being the boomer cons, and then a rejection of the idea of progress because you're accepting the left's frame that progress is only in their direction.
Yes.
So it's all about kind of that's why you have right and left at level six. Um, because a lot of people on the right are either accepting the left frame or you said like at level
Yes. So
denying the progress. Yeah.
the Nazis are at level six, and Nietzsche was at level six, where the Nazis are right wing, but they're also nihilist and morally relativist. Their idea is that if morals aren't real, it's fine that we genocide people because the soul doesn't exist, because there's no meaning in the world. So we can just Darwinistically genocide people. Peterson got the right to level seven. Because Peterson brought in these Jungian symbols stemming from the Hermetica, which taught the public in the concept of universals like good or evil. And this is why Maps of Meaning is probably one of the most important books of this century, because Maps of Meaning is the cross section of neurology, religion, philosophy, and psychology, where Peterson brings back concepts like good and evil, chaos and order, masculine and feminine. So we are judging our worldview based upon the universal traits that are shared across all of history. And this is what's going to kill the death of God and the myth of progress. These ideas of ideal universals like good or God or peace or whatever that we can judge the material against. In our worldview, it's the God of progress.
Yeah, and those kill the subjectivist worldview because when you have unseen concepts like good and evil
Yeah.
tied back in, it becomes less about just subjective cultural preference. Because ironically, the Nazis might be okay with genociding people, but there's also the view that they're not judging those people because they're saying that that system is the best for them, whatever
Yes.
system that foreigner uses to govern. There's no kind of relatable principle. So you're not saying that you're better, except for maybe through the result of your extermination and power game level success.
Yes.
Because so that then you reduce good to another material conception, and then there's other universalists who are naive about the lack of real cultural momentum and cultural context and having to interpret things through cultural context, which makes people think that there's nothing universal at all, when in reality, like we said, it's through lines. So you can
Yes.
relate universal principles to cultures that are legitimately different.
So from the 18th to the 20th century, you saw the gradual deepening of atheist sentiments from the elite and the upper class down to the most basic level of the civilization. Because there are these sorts of unconscious understandings in the collective psyche, and these determine what a society is capable of thinking. In the medieval world, they didn't think about AI because they didn't have the same collective psyche with the concepts that could let them think about AI. In the same way that we don't think about the Enochians or the race of angels that John Dee talked to. And so in the 18th century, you saw thinking separated from religion, and we should make an enlightenment video in the future once I'm done listening to the audiobook I'm currently listening to on the enlightenment. But the enlightenment, it was an intellectual fluorescent, an intellectual breakthrough that didn't have quality control. So the issue with the Enlightenment is that if you can make any rationalistic argument for something, it's true. And there wasn't fact checking or really testing which Enlightenment theories were worked, which is why modern right wing and the left wing and other philosophies stem from Enlightenment thought, where Enlightenment thought just went into every different field, but because there was no method of assessing which theories were accurate or not, over time, free thought took a very nihilistic and very socially destructive point, because without quality control, the arguments the mob wanted to hear the most were the ones that got popularized. And so this resulted in the rise of the religion of leftism, or the religion of progress, which a lot of these authors talk about, where the aesthetic of reason through progress destroyed actual reason. And the first place that saw the decline in religiosity was France. And France was significantly before the rest of Europe. And we've also got to talk about the rest of the world, because the death of gods as true outside the West as inside the West. But France saw the decline of religiosity in the 18th century, and especially so among educated people in the Parisian bureaucrat nobility, where bureaucrats destroy religion in the modern world because bureaucrats want everything controllable. And the reason that we think history is over and the death of enchantment and God and these things is because the bureaucracy wants to portray all of reality as things they can control and manage. So France saw the rise of the managerial class in the 18th century, and atheism became popularized among the courts and the nobility and the educated people. And one of the things de Tocqueville talks about is that they spread these ideas to the population. The French Revolution happened, which was an overtly atheist state in the late 18th century, where they persecuted Christianity, they worshipped the goddess of reason, they tried to make a new religion, and a lot of the philosophy of the modern left stems from this era of French philosophy. Between Saint Simone developed almost all the elements of modern leftism with the desired priesthood of science in the late 18th century, and even concepts like trans or using a migration from the third world to liberate the first world were all in Saint Simone and his buddies' thoughts. And they wanted to make an interchangeable new man. So that percolated, caused the French Revolution, then Napoleon. Then those ideas went to the rest of Europe from the Napoleonic Wars. And then the French nobility became super religious again, and then enforced religion back on the population, so that in the 19th century, France was a significantly more religious country than in the 18th century.
Right, which it makes it easy to forget that there was this period in 1800 with, a period piece type setting that is totally atheistic and just persecuting Christians. I feel like maybe that element of the French Revolution isn't covered as much in entertainment. We get Les Mis and the
Yeah.
poverty focus, but it would be interesting to really see like fully atheist, rationalistic society dressed up in old clothes.
Yeah.
Uh,
I've been on an extensive French Revolution and Enlightenment reading binge lately, and it's useful to see these 18th century figures having worldviews comparable to Redditors. I don't find a single dissimilarity between French revolutionary thought and Reddit thought, where it's the Western left, so it's very degenerate and feminine and subjectivist and utopian compared to Eastern leftism or communism, which is like Mao and Stalin, more hierarchical, more militaristic, those things. But almost every single argument you would see a Redditor make today, like saying religion is bad because it's physically not true, or saying that we need to get rid of the workday and replace it with a workday half as long because then the workers will be happier and work harder. All of these arguments existed in the 18th century, and they had they were only popular among educated people, except for France. And with France, you saw with the decline of religiosity that occurred a century before the rest of Europe, France's birth rate crashed, and they stopped having the ability to populate their colonies, which resulted in Germany and Britain outcompeting them, as well as socialism arising in Latin Europe earlier. Because the decline of religion causes the rise of socialism, because envy, you can't have control. It's harder to have controls on envy if people don't think they're going to get into heaven, or that there isn't a sense of God controlling the world. And so Spain and Italy were the next countries that saw the death of God after France, while Britain and Germany had a religious revival. A lot of Europe had a religious revival in the mid 19th century, and then over the course of the mid to late 19th century, you saw a second wave of atheist sentiment spread around Europe. So that before World War One, you saw another state where you could have seen an upswelling of atheist takeover of the entire civilization, which you saw under the French Revolution, but which had been masked by the right wing successful right wing counter revolution in the mid 19th century, but then said successful conservative counter revolution forced the leftist movements to go underground, strengthen their philosophy, and then jump out again, where the 19th century saw the development of almost all of the philosophy that became modern leftism in the modernist worldview, where Fire in the Minds of Men by Billington likes to talk about how the Darwinistic competition between different leftist social clubs in the 19th century created the modern left, where it was very small groups of leftist organizations constantly competing over who would become the next popular leftist ideology, and Marx was the guy who rose to the top.
Yeah, and this is the problem with entirely abandoning elite politics, because if you get what you wish for, and all that you have left is like an angry crowd, then the only way people will rise is speaking unconsciously to that crowd, like a crowd
Yes.
without, like we talked about them losing, like the nobility is who um, organizes society back into a Christian landscape post French Revolution. So I'm wondering, like, what's our organizing principle for helping to return a legitimate Christianity that doesn't result in like unconscious crowd?
Um, you have to integrate science and Christianity, which is easier than it sounds, but it's going to take it's yeah, it's easier than it sounds. It's just it requires a different framing than what this episode has. It involves
Right.
shattering the binary. If you shatter the binary between mystic, religion, and science, you would do it. And that's much easier than it looks because it involves the incorporation of human consciousness. You create a natural science originally stems from natural science, and natural science was the alchemical pursuit of increasing consciousness through combination of mysticism, religion, and science. So we would have to return to the natural science, which puts it all under a single ideal of increasing consciousness.
Right. So you basically just need quality thought and the dissemination of it and positive cultural movements. It's just basically a battle. But if you don't succeed in that battle, it's why it's important to focus on. Because if you don't succeed in that battle, then it doesn't matter if you're left or right. If you just create a landscape in which there is no value landscape, then you're not going to be leading it. It's going to be whatever the envy and resentment and the crowd combined with the lack of truth as a principle is going to form its own conclusions outside of your hopes and dreams. So that's why it's important not just to tear down.
That's not what I said. What I was trying to convey is that
Mhm.
you need to perceive how you perceive your environment. You then need to perceive how others perceive their environments. You have to then cross reference how different consciousnesses perceive the world. And then from that, try to figure out which systems of consciousness work the best. So you have to pit worldviews in Darwinistic competition with each other to try to figure out underlying principles of the cross section between science, religion, and mysticism. But
Right. And without this leveling up of consciousness, which is what I was trying to refer to, then it's a little bit difficult. And you can't have a general leveling up of consciousness because that gets into perfecting humanity. So then you need an elite structure. But
yes,
yeah, and this what I was getting into with this is the Pope, because Pope Leo at the turn of Pope Leo the Eighth at the turn of the 19th century He had the encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was basically about dealing with the transition um, around the time of the death of God. So I thought maybe we could get into the politics of that and how it related to like the modern period.
I'm sorry, we won't have the time, unless it's like 2 minutes. I
Okay,
have to
well,
get.
I'll summarize it then.
Yes.
Basically, so that was the turning point. You have these big populist movements. There's this huge socialist pressure. The church has stopped being a leader, right? So we're getting back into like
Yes.
elite leadership structures. They lost the ability to produce culture or move culture. So then they started defensively following culture.
Yes.
And Pope Leo's Rerum Novarum about subsidiarity was a kind of way, it was kind of the invention of neoliberalism because he talked about the importance of property rights and all of that stuff, but that there was also a need to address social issues. And so you basically have, yeah, sure, markets, but regulated with welfare, which
Yes.
is that didn't become the leading ideology. He tried to, slow down socialism, but it didn't work. But that we came back to that point after World War II. And now we're getting to a point where with the new pope, people were saying, "Oh, what's he going to be named?" And I guess like I was, or not even a guess. I was like, it would be kind of cool if he was Leo because of the parallels. And then he did become Leo, and he
Yeah.
specifically cited in his speech that these are times equivalent to the Industrial Revolution in terms of disruption. So it's important to basically he's kind of leaning. You have Javier Milei giving him Hayek's book. He's a little bit more uh, not totally outright communist, but still very much talking about managing the consequences of
Yes.
social disruption. So he, it's like a yin yang. Where we're at this potential tipping point in the other direction, like we've been talking about. And the current pope is probably worse than the last pope, or more progressive than the late 1800s pope, just by the virtue of when he was born. But the direction could be in the opposite way. So if you have a yin yang, the new pope is the little black dot, the old pope is a little white dot surrounded by black. I'm hoping we're
Yes.
surrounded by white. So
It's
fun
inter-
little. Mhm.
It's interesting how the Catholics got stuck in oppositional attitudes to their own secularism movements, which were the strongest. Where Catholic Europe saw the strongest secularism movements, including in places like Mexico that had atheist revolutions, because Catholicism did not adapt to the new scientific ways in forms that Protestantism was very good at. So Protestant Europe stayed religious longer than Catholic Europe because different new Protestant sects could form with the rate of scientific change. In Catholic Europe, the Catholic Church stayed more reactionary, and then it created these strong secular forces where in countries like France or Italy, where people were as educated as North Europe, they weren't able to adjust to. You had this disconnect between the stated religion that was you had to be Catholic in the 18th century and parts of the 19th century in Latin Europe. So they started having a lot of very strong atheist movements where the Catholic Church until the early 20th century was seen as being incredibly reactionary, although it did go through several changes like that. And now the Catholic Church is overreacting by being seen as very liberal now. And it's interesting, though, that most of the most important thinkers in secularism were from the Protestant countries. Because although the average European in the 18th and 19th centuries was very religious, or if you asked the average British person in 1870, they'd be very Protestant. Same thing with the average German, is you saw the intellectual buildup in the 18th century, where the Enlightenment was a heavily atheist movement on top of a very atheist Europe, where by the rise of Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, Kant was this force that argued a little bit for. Kant argued that there are universals because universals exist inside the mind, which he was making a pro-religion argument against a very anti-religion Enlightenment, where Kant kind of created this faction of the Enlightenment that was more pro-religion, but in the process of rationalizing religion, um, In the process of rationalizing religion scientifically, he also got rid of a lot of the final philosophic elements religion had had. But then over the course of the 19th century, you saw the development of more complex ways that the religion of progress could go across more of life. Where you saw over the 19th century the gradual removal of religion due to the Industrial Revolution over people's intersocial relationships, politics, marriage, the culture, where the real breaking point with the formal death of the religious order that was based out of God was World War One. But Nietzsche in the 1880s could see that the actual idea of religion had already died. It just hadn't worked through the population yet. Where Nietzsche, when he proclaimed the death of God in the 1880s, he was saying, Europeans don't actually believe in God. We pretend to as this sort of ritual. And then what's going to happen is that within the next generation, all of the moral foundations built upon God will collapse.
Right. It's like a polling error where everyone says they're Christian, but then if you dissect the actual values of the population, it's not the same as the polls. Like
Yes.
nobody says they want to vote for Trump, and then you look at the results and it's like, oh, turns out people are Trump supporters.
Yes. I mean, if you have a purely materialist worldview, religion's impossible. And the West just tried to maintain this illusion that they can be both philosophically materialist and religious, and they can't. And so, as materialism spread across the society, so did de facto atheism. And if you look at early 20th century Europe, almost all Europeans were religious if polled, but if you actually looked at the population's actions, they were supporting these progress-based religions, with the Soviet Union being an explicitly atheist religion. And that spread to the Orient with Mao or Vietnam or those places. Then the Nazis were also practically atheists, where they heavily discriminated against the Christians, although they put up this public act of respecting Christianity. And you saw the rise of socialism and liberalism across the rest of Europe, where once you get to World War One, because philosophic and intellectual breakthroughs always presage social shifts, is that by World War One, practically none of Europe's social code was actually religious. And what Nietzsche predicted was that the 20th century would be a century of nihilism, where he said that tyrannies would arise across Europe. That was true. Europe would lose any will to continue. Europe would lose its global dominance. And he said that by the time of the early 21st century, and that no one would understand his teachings till the year 2000, that the West would be the society of the last men, because there'd be these hollow nihilism would be the dominant social code, while it would pretend on paper to have a Christian society, but in reality nihilism would dominate. And the age of the last men would be a society that would glorify mediocrity and weakness and nihilism. And the West would be trying to tear itself apart out of nihilism, would be incapable of just sustaining itself.
There's a nice thing with self-correcting mechanisms where it's at when things are at their worst, it's the easiest to do the most good or be the
Yes.
best. And it makes me think of the game theory simulator around reciprocal behavior, where reciprocal behavior, which you can associate kind of with Christianity, and the golden rule, general religion, is it gets wiped out by cheaters and all these other things till it's down to like one or two out of the 100 characters in the simulators, and then the incentive shifts where there's a big advantage, and then it grows and overtakes the whole board
Yes.
and wipes out the other kind of behaviors. So I'm hoping with, taking the parallels of early Rome Christianity, the chaos of now, the symmetry of the popes and the idea, not that it'll come through the Catholic Church, the 2000-year cycle, we're at a potentially very interesting point
Yes.
with regards to game theory.
And that will happen, and I have complete certainty that the age of God, the death of God will end, and it will probably end I don't know, it might end centuries from now, but I think it's going to end sooner. I mean, at least Nietzsche said that the age of the last man would come crashing down in the early 21st century and it would fall quickly because he said no one would be willing to sustain the age of the last men because an age of nihilism will not promote men who fight for it. But the also, and I'm shocked I didn't mention this before, but this isn't the only death of God in history. Where if you look at the previous civilizational cycles, there have been lengthy periods of atheism or agnosticism, especially so in the ancient world, where Qixi Huangdi in 2nd century BC China, he enforced this atheist legalist state which tried to kill Confucianism. Greco-Roman civilization had huge amounts of atheism and agnosticism. Before the Axial Age in 500 BC, you saw this mass period of collapse of religion, where the Axial Age saw the Sun Tzu, it saw Confucius, Lao Tzu, Buddha, and Socrates and Plato living at the same time because due to social shifts, the old codes broke down. Where when a society isn't religious, what it's really saying is that our old moral code is incapable of mapping our lived experience, where the Industrial Revolution created such a huge shift in way of life that the old pre-industrial religions couldn't suit people's lived experiences as well as all the new evidence. And so this created this huge gap that was filled largely by rationalizations of what people wanted to believe. And in all of those historic societies, what happens is that as the social code breaks down, with the 1960s being the intellectual defenses were taken down over the Enlightenment. Then the political structure changed with World War I, and then these religious remnants in the social structure collapsed in the 1960s. So what we're seeing is the end point of the death of God, the removal of the sacred from every element of human life, so that human life has no reason to survive or build or procreate, so our societies are collapsing, which means that if we don't fix this issue, we're all going to fucking die, so someone will end up fixing it. And that's just how societies work, because when people are faced with death, they're going to balk and figure something else. At least that's what I have to believe, cries.
Right.
And
And the goal is the more we can articulate this, the less things have to get bad for
yes,
people to change. So
yes. And it always happens historically that you see religious breakthroughs that fix this because man is an innately religious animal. And when you remove religion from man, the humans will fail as a society. Some individuals are strong enough to live without God, but most aren't. And so there will be a religious breakthrough because fundamentally we think that a world without science is a world without meaning. And there's no logical reason whatsoever to believe that. Nihilism is a choice you make where different societies wire people's neurology to different settings. Our society has wired our neurology to very nihilistic ends because we're a society built around mate suppression and envy where everyone's trying to hurt everyone else and tear others down. But we don't have to live like this.
nope, and it creates a real opportunity because, like you said, the last man example, the point of the last man is that you can kind of tear through the core of a rotted society in the same way that when you're down to just a couple reciprocal behavior dots, they grow faster than they have
Yes.
when they had much higher numbers. So
Yes. Um,
good times ahead.
so yeah, the point that there have been previous deaths of religion before and that it's a transitionary phase is very important because don't take things too seriously. Don't take the intellectual currents of this moment that seriously, where it's
Hmm.
important to compare all of human history, to compare your thinking to all thinking over human history, to know that if they could wake up in the morning and have a reason to live, so can you. We don't have to pick this path. And one of the things and when we realize that we can choose our own psyches and we can choose our own psychological spiritual states, that we will develop institutions to route them towards the best option. in a way that makes sense to modern audiences. I hate that word, modern audiences.
Mhm.
But one of the things I want to emphasize, because this is often forgotten, is the death of God is not a purely Western phenomena. Where, for example, the Middle East has seen a radical collapse in religion over the 21st century.
Mhm.
As of now, America is more religious with a higher birth rate than Iran.
Very interesting. Yeah, I could see a big death of God in the Middle East because I've also been predicting the Middle East develops soon, um, which is going to come with a disruption
Yes.
of some of their, yeah.
The collapse of Islam in the Middle East is highly correlated with the adoption of TikTok. And most of the Middle East is industrialized now. So we've seen religiosity decline in Arabia, in the UAE, in the Middle East, in Turkey. Um, and
And that's been interrupted by war. So we're going to see the Middle East industrialize faster than people realize because they've already been capable of doing it for
yes.
30 years. Go ahead. Sorry.
Um, East Asia is a place with the most atheists in the world, where out of any society in the world, the death of God was the biggest in China. And I've been to China, and I frequently think, what would happen if you took a Taoist sage and showed them modern China? If you because Taoism believes in spontaneity and magic and following the life force in rural, and if you showed them the
Hmm.
civilization that they built in thousands of years in the future with the Communist Party and mass China's the most soulless place I've seen in the world. It's mass
Yeah.
corporatism, big government, no God. Because the Chinese Communist Party is one of the most overtly anti-religious organizations in history. And imagine if you showed this, because I follow China a lot, this Taoist sage, some Chinese youth who will never get married, works 14 hours a day, lives in his pod, and he'd be like, this is what my descendants are doing.
It's kind of funny that adopting the shadow of Christianity through their connection to the Marxists in Europe is probably going to end up eventually making China Christian because they're integrating the shadow so well that any solution is going to be have to be in context of that framework, which is just going to put them back at Christianity, there is a big rising Christian movement in China that was pretty successfully shut out by the government, but there's a lot of energy there.
So I don't think China's going to convert to Christianity. They've had two bastardizations of Christianity that nearly took over them. Communism's one. The Taiping Rebellion, where Hong Xiuquan said he was the second son of Christ and launched a war that killed 20 million people in the 19th century. Another version. But so the issue we're in is we're in a historic waiting room where there's a historic event that needs to happen. It hasn't happened yet. And the event that's going to happen will be of similar proportion and shift to World War One. And the world in 1914 is not the world in 1918, where across Asia we have seen civilizational fossilization, and Asia hasn't really been able to culturally change for thousands of years before European colonialism jolted them open. So Asia needs to see this huge philosophic breakthrough to get them to innovate again, to get out of their old stultified civilizational forms. And for the West, it's easier because the West has this pre-established philosophic structure on how to do improvement and how to shift as a society. The East doesn't. But the one thing they have, I think in India, you could see India had highly advanced mystic traditions, and their top scientist class are people who were genetically built to be mystics. That's what the Brahmins were. The Brahmins were bred for mystic abilities. So out of India, I could see an integration of Indian mysticism with science to create new religious structures. In China, Taoism is their best ability. So if
Right.
they get out of this, I think it would be something like it would be pulling on some sort of Taoist or Zen route. But the problem is that modern Asians in a lot of ways are more left brain and less religiously focused even than Westerners are. They've become very materialistic and corporate. So I think it's going to take a lot of suffering to get those countries to think more creatively.
Yep, and that's what we're talking about how this is going to happen eventually because that's what the demand of the moments require is a return to religion. But what happens in between there is up to us, and it relates to our other framework about Hobbes and Rousseau kind of stuck in this framework versus Locke, um, and without establishing alternate values in the midst of the death of God, we're screwed. And that's how I, at least for a bit, we'll feel the pain. And that's how I explained Germany to people and the rise of Marxism in the 30s and et cetera, is when you're trying to explain how fundamentally socialist this Central Western Europe was at that time, the easiest way to do it is just to show that God was dead. God died, and this
Yes.
filled in the vacuum, and that's how you know it's fundamentally the Nazis are fundamentally part of the Marxist paradigm, is because they're in the context of the death of
Yes.
God.
Yes. I apologize for spurging out here, but I just noticed from your body language that both of us are talking to an imaginary third person. So I was looking at your body language, and it's as if we were in a room. You're looking at me for certain bits. You're looking at the imaginary third person for other bits, because both of us create this archetypal imagining of the crowd, which we alternate our body language to talk to. Apologies. I think that's cool.
That's
But
funny.
the thing with the death of God is that Nietzsche, there's this madman who runs around town screaming, God is dead, God is dead. And everyone thinks he's a madman because he sees something they can't, that their entire worldview will shift because God is dead. And so the internal motivation of every European and the European psyche changed, and that killed Europe. The death of religion killed Europe. So this event that no one noticed, that Nietzsche was called a madman at the time, it completely changed Europe in a way no other event did. And what I like to say is that Nietzsche has his own death of God, but no one has yet realized the second death of God, the death of God, because there will have to come a point where we realize that if we keep following around this path, and I can't overstate how big this is, because I'm thinking the death of God affects everything from Argentina to Korea. It affects the entire industrialized world. The only place that is not affected is Africa, where even Latin America, Southeast Asia, India are seeing the psychological effects of the death of God, in that the death of God has become the same thing as mouse utopia. It's become nihilism, collapsing birth rates, lack of will to live, or in the Pax Americana, America has domesticated the entire world, including itself, where no one can live through their own life story. Americans can't be Americans. Burmese people can't
Mhm.
be Burmese. No one can live out their own area's mythology or their own journey, where we froze the world in nihilism. And what people need to realize is we can choose to not live like this. We can call God. I mean, we could return to these pre-industrial worldviews, and it would happen through shifts in our neurology. It would happen through shifts in our perception of consciousness, where we would study how pre-industrial societies interact with consciousness and replicate it. We can do this wherever. All of this is self-induced, and it's this hypnosis we've been put under, where we can choose to wake up at any time, but no one realizes we can. Everyone seems to think that we're stuck on this path towards greater and greater intractable nihilism, and it's true
Mhm.
until we snap out of the illusion.
And that's why everybody's temporary political vision of what's inevitable and what's not inevitable, usually based in some form of nihilism,
Yeah.
you should disregard. Those are very specific human frames. Like,
Yes.
take them for what they're worth on their analysis level, but don't get sucked into a nihilistic vision of, oh, because we won't get this, this won't happen, and we're totally screwed, and we have to, harden our hearts and blah, 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 blah. So that, yeah, that's a part of it. I like how you mentioned the homeless guy, because I make that joke. It's like increasingly, it's not just the crazy guy in the town square who understands society is collapsing. And so we need to
Yes.
spread that and have a non-panicked reaction, a constructive reaction around it.
Yes, that's accurate. And it's the thing I'm going to finish with is that there's a great book called Nihilism by Seraphim Rose. And Seraphim Rose was an Orthodox theologian who apparently has a big cult audience online. So whenever I talk about him, people will be like, I am glad you're reading the Blessed Father. And Seraphim Rose wrote a book called Nihilism, which is a study of how every element of modern society leads back to nihilism, between our government system, um, the way I perceive this is
Mm.
that your mental thought patterns can either ultimately lead upwards or downwards. If they lead towards your life matters, you lead up towards God. If they don't, they lead downwards naturally. And because in our society, in every single element of life, between art, between government, between our society, between our marital norms, between whatever, we do things not because they aim upwards. We do them because life doesn't matter just because we do them. And of course, people are nihilistic and don't have the will to live because nothing they do matters by definition.
There's good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth
Yes.
fighting for.
And Seraphim Rose said the modern world is divided between those who numb itself to its insanity through it to its meaninglessness through one hedonism or another, or those who realize it and go crazy. And um, I guess I realized it and went crazy. So, well, thank you for this episode, and I will catch you next week for the Holy Roman Empire.
Peace.
Goodbye.